So Richard Wolff recently interviewed Katie Halper on his Economic Update podcast. And there's some things said here about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Also, political divide and where do we go from here? Again, I want you to listen to this with the word reform in mind. And then I'm going to break down some parts here and there. Because the point that I want to make tonight with all of these stories that I've shown you, the point that I want to make is that reform does not work. It just doesn't. The reason why reform does not work is because when you reform something, you may get a little win here and there, but you never override the system. You're still playing in the same system that you said was so corrupt. You can apply that to police system, the policing system in this country, and you can also apply that to putting progressive through the Democratic Party. You can apply that to Joe Biden. You can apply it to Wall Street. You can apply it to the education system. Reforms do not work. Let's get into this story. I have a lot to say.
Jason.
What about the idea that the culture wars, so-called, fighting around religion or abortion or guns and all of that, is some sort of substitute, some sort of dry run, maybe, for a more basic civil war around economic and more philosophic issue? Is there anything to this notion of culture war as either preliminary or form, if you like, of a more basic civil war?
Well, I think the primary function of the culture wars is to serve as a distraction from kind of socioeconomic shared interests. And I think it lets the Republicans screw people over while pretending that they're fighting for their best interest. They can kind of distract people with these culture war issues. And I want to be clear, I don't think something like abortion is unimportant. I just think that it's something that Republicans run on, Democrats run on in different ways, obviously. I mean, Republicans run on it trying to, and sometimes successfully, limiting women's right to bodily autonomy and right to choose, reproductive freedom. And they are very successful at eroding this right. And obviously we see this more, and it's even scarier than ever with the Supreme Court. Then you have Democrats who run on it, but they haven't really done anything to codify Roe v. Wade, but they get to fundraise off of it. I think that that's really the function of the culture wars. It serves as a distraction, and that way both Republicans and Democrats, I don't want to totally equate them, but certainly they're both beholden to donors, and they both have they share overlapping donors.
Okay. They're talking about the culture war as a distraction. It's true. They do get people to focus on these cultural issues so that you're not paying attention to the economic issues which affect the majority of us. Here's the thing. Now, Katie just told you that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, a lot of times, they have their donors, they have shared donors, right? This is part of the reason why trying to reform the Democratic Party does not work. You have the donors, you have shared donors. So if the Democrats and Republicans have shared donors, they have shared interests. That's why the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are against the progressives. Neither of them want the progressives there. Don't get it twisted. The Democratic Party doesn't want them there, and the Republicans don't want them there. And the progressives in Congress know that. Why? What did the progressives do differently in reference to the corporate Democrats and, of course, the Republican Party there as well? The progressives ran grassroots campaigns. Now, we can go into logistics later on about billionaire money going into Justice Democrats and Sunrise Movement and all of that. I've talked about that multiple times on this show. But when it comes to the individual donations, the way that they actually fundraise, they ran grassroots campaigns. That's a threat. The Republicans in Congress and the Democrats, the corporate Democrats in Congress, see that as a threat because you just showed the American people that you can get elected without taking corporate money. They don't like that. And their donors don't like that either. Let's go back in.
And so what they're able to do is show these shiny objects, what would be the equivalent of a shiny object, which are these culture war issues. They get to hide behind those and continue to screw people over economically.
Well, I noticed, which I appreciate in your work, an interest in history and using history to make comparisons, to draw lessons. So let me ask you to follow up on what you just said. What happened, in your view, to the Democratic Party?
Yeah, that's something I think a lot about, and I think it's really up for debate. And in terms of the history of the Democratic Party selling people out, I'm a big fan of Thomas Frank in general, but especially of his work, Listen Liberal, Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. And I think that, the Democrats were always more hawkish than people like to admit. They also were less, Roosevelt was unique, I think, in his, and you'd know about this much more than I would as an economist, but Roosevelt was unique in how he championed the rights of working people.
And let's go ahead and break something up here. What happened to the Democratic Party? Money. You see, Ralph Nader talked about this as well. Ralph Nader was able to fight back against General Motors. In an interview, I played it on the show before, Ralph Nader said, yeah, we were able to do those things because we didn't have political action committees back then. They didn't have PACs. Money happened to the Democratic Party. That's why it changed. Ralph Nader went on to say in that interview that he could never do what he did back then, fighting against General Motors, with the Congress that we have in place right now, because it's all bought and paid for. Money is what happened to the Democratic Party. I just want to go ahead and add that part in there. And then there was a piece she said here.
The Republicans screw people over while pretending that they're fighting for their best interest. They can kind of distract people with these culture.
Not that piece. This part right about here.
To the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's something I think a lot about, and I think it's really up for debate. And in terms of the history of the Democratic Party selling people.
See, that's the part I don't think is up for debate. When Katie goes to say it's up for debate, no, I just told you what happened. Money. I don't see how that's debatable. I really don't. Political action committees, super PACs, that's what happened. She went on to mention FDR, and listen to this.
People out. I'm a big fan of Thomas Frank in general, but especially of his work, Listen Liberal, Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. And I think that, the Democrats were always more hawkish than people like to admit. They also were less, Roosevelt was unique, I think, in his, and you'd know about this much more than I would as an economist, but Roosevelt was unique in how he championed the rights of working people. And his social democratic approach to politics, which we haven't really seen. I mean, we saw some of that with JFK and LBJ, but
a lot of progressives like to mention FDR and how he championed workers' rights, but they also leave out the fact that FDR also screwed over Black people and Native Americans with his New Deal policies as well. They don't mention that. If you want to hear that, you got to listen to me, or you got to listen to RBN. You got to listen to Black Power Media. You have to listen to Black commentators, because the white leftist commentators are not telling you that. That's a piece I think that people need to hear. And I don't know if it's just because they don't know. Maybe they do know, but that part needs to be said. And I know that because I've done a lot of research on that myself. So when we say he championed workers, he championed which workers? White workers. didn't champion Native Americans, didn't champion Black Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't benefit somewhat from the New Deal, but we didn't get the same damn benefit that white people did. Let's be real. All right, let's go back in.
I think that with Bill Clinton especially, we saw a kind of recasting, a more overt almost embrace of moderate politics, centrist politics that, and then of course there's the Cold War, right, which made Democrats run away from the left and afraid of their own shadows, and that's a whole other issue. But I think that one thing, going back to Thomas Frank, that is interesting is this idea that Democrats, it's not that they're cowardly and inept. They actually don't want a lot of the things that they claim that they want, the things that they claim to champion. So I grew up always thinking they were just kind of spineless, but it's not spinelessness. It's actually, I think, political theater. I think that so I think we have Clintonianism, and then we also have a very dangerous weaponization of identity politics, where identity politics are kind of hijacked and used to distract from economic exploitation. It's the opposite of what it was invented to be when it was created, that term, by the Combahee River Collective. The women who did that were radical. The people who now have taken that term or that movement have totally hijacked it. And so what we see is, for instance, Hillary Clinton, who famously said, "Is breaking up the banks and racism, no." And that was a straw man issue, because no one was saying that breaking up the banks would end racism. She was clearly trying to undermine Bernie Sanders' focus on economic justice. And
now I will add something here. When it comes to identity politics, the Democrats play this better than no one else. They play it better than no one else. They played it heavily with Barack Obama, heavily with Hillary Clinton. You could have the first Black president when Hillary was running for 2016. You can have the first female president. They do that a lot, and they usually do well with it, but not in 2016. Americans didn't fall for it that time. That was the wrong identity to that was the wrong person to use identity with, because people really do not like Hillary Clinton. I'm sorry. I'm laughing because it's still funny to me, because I think a lot of liberals just seem to be shocked that so many people dislike Hillary Clinton. Yeah, she won the popular vote, but she still lost to a reality TV star. And let's also be real. Look at the way that people came out for Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama versus Joe Biden. The turnout really wasn't there. Even though a lot of African Americans, when polled, said we would support Hillary Clinton, when it came time to vote, the numbers weren't there. So I'm sorry, but it's just funny to me that they can't understand why people dislike Hillary Clinton. But let's go back into the video. I'm sorry. It's just funny to me.
Irony is, of course, that, as you know better than me, better than I do, the housing crisis and the banking crisis were very racialized, and the people who suffered the most were people of color. So that is a great example of the cynical weaponization of identity politics to not only undermine economic justice, but to also undermine economic justice that has very racialized components to it. And that would have helped. Of course, it wouldn't, breaking up the banks wouldn't end racism, but it just shows how little these people like Hillary Clinton actually care. They don't even, it's not only that they reject economic justice and don't see the connection between economic justice and racial justice or gender.
So she mentions the housing issue and the groups that were targeted. And she said people of color. Yes, Latinos were a part of that as well, but it was elder African Americans that were targeted. They were going after Black elders' homes. And I'm sorry. Yes, sometimes we do have to say people of color, but in that particular situation, it was Black elders that were targeted because they knew, okay, let me go target this older Black person who's probably, they may not read all the paperwork. They may not understand it all. You know, they worked their whole lives, paid the house off. And I'm going to do a whole separate show about what happened with that, with one woman in particular. It goes off of the documentary, The Con. But they heavily targeted Black elders. So a lot of Black elders lost their homes. Black wealth tanked under Barack Obama. But the media kind of glossed over it. Barack Obama made excuses for why he could not bail out the American people, why he had to bail out the banks. None of them were prosecuted. None of them were arrested for it. And people still lost their homes. But again, there's another thing I notice. It seems to happen within this space. People want to be like, people of color, In this particular situation, they targeted Black elders. And another thing I want to add too about the whole people of color thing, some of the things that I've noticed from my experience, it's really funny to me. Some groups don't want to be considered people of color until someone reminds them that they're not white. Black people never have that option. We always know that we are on the other side. But it isn't until sometimes other groups have to end up going through some type of oppression with us, all of a sudden we're people of color. Sorry, but I had to say that. I had to say it. It cracks me up when people do that.
Issues, but they actually embrace policies which disproportionately hurt people of color while running as these champions of racial justice, while running as a feminist. Same thing with not supporting Fight for 15, the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage to $15, which Bernie Sanders, of course, supported. Hillary Clinton didn't. And that is, as people may know, the majority of minimum wage earners are women and people of color. And so, again, it's just this example of progressive in name, but not in policy. And so we see that is, I think, one of the most dangerous things about today's Democratic Party is how they use these very important issues, but not only do they sell people out economically, but they're also contributing to this vast racial inequality.
And they co-opted the term progressive. Everybody's a progressive now. Have you noticed? Chantel Brown's a progressive. Ted Lieu's a progressive. Everybody has co-opted that. They took the term. They took it. It's a damn shame how they just able to take that term like that, and people aren't even questioning it. Let's go on.
So then what is going to represent the people on the left who might once have seen the Democratic Party as in some way an expression of their needs, wants, desires, and interests?
Right.
Are we forever condemned to have two conservative parties just with different names?
Yeah, I
Notice how Richard Wolff said two conservative parties, because that's really what you have. That's really what you have, guys. Now, I could say this to some of my friends that are liberal. They like Hillary, they like Biden. I could say this to them and they're like, what are you talking about? We're for abortion. We're for gay rights. We're for da-da-da. I was like, yeah, some of y'all were also for calling the police on Black people that came to your neighborhood too. Mention that part. Some of you were also for not having Black people go to school with you too. You say you were for equal rights and you wanted people to have equal educational opportunities, but you didn't want them in your neighborhood though. Mention that part. That's the thing about liberals. That's the thing I keep telling people. They're just as racist too. They pretend like they're not. They say they care. And I'm writing an article on this actually right now. This will be out later this week. I'm writing an article talking about how liberals perpetuate racism. It's all going to be in there. I'm almost done with it. I got a couple more paragraphs, but that'll be in part of my Substack. But I'm just letting you know, come on. The liberals, they kill me, man. They kill me. But he's right. Two conservative parties.
I don't know the answer to that. I obviously was someone you can probably tell was a huge Bernie Sanders supporter, and he was, he was marginalized and denigrated. And I think that I go back and forth, honestly, on what I think about the Democratic Party. I mean, we live in a duopoly, obviously. So, and we live in a duopoly where there aren't that many progressives. And even with the squad, we saw they all voted for the $40 billion for proxy war in Ukraine.
We live in a duopoly. And also, we have the progressives and with the squad, how they've been voting. They're not separate. The squad is a part of that duopoly. The squad members are Democrats. I don't know why we feel the need to not call them that, but that's what they are. They are Democrats. They've been voting the way that corporate Democrats want them to vote. They have not been fighting for these progressive issues that they ran on. They wouldn't even force a vote. They have to go ask Nancy Pelosi permission to do certain things that they want to do. They are Democrats. I think we should stop talking about them as if they are this separate entity. They are a part of the Democratic Party. They are just as corrupt. They're with them now. And they've been behaving in such a way as well. So we may live in a duopoly, but the squad lives in that duopoly too. They're actually a part of it. And just because we live in a duopoly doesn't mean this is where we need to stay. Let's go on.
Flooding Ukraine with weapons, basically. I think, though, that we can't totally write off electoralism because, you know, that is the system that exists. If people want to try to grow third parties, that's certainly admirable.
And this is why reform does not work. I want you to listen to what Katie just said. This is the telling piece. This piece right here. Hold on, let me go back. Hear it one more time.
Are we forever condemned to have two conservative parties just with different names?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I obviously was someone you can probably tell was a huge Bernie Sanders supporter, and he was, you know, he was marginalized and denigrated. And I think that I go back and forth, honestly, on what I think about the Democratic Party. I mean, we live in a duopoly, obviously. So, and we live in a duopoly where there aren't that many progressives. And even with the squad, we saw they all voted for the $40 billion for proxy war in Ukraine, flooding Ukraine with weapons, basically. I think, though, that we can't totally write off electoralism because, you know, that is the system that exists. If people want to try to grow.
That is the system that exists. Let's talk about systems that exist. The policing system that we have right now in this country. I told you I was making a connection with these stories tonight. The policing system that we have in this country right now, the system of policing in this country is not working. Not for the American people. It's not working for Black people. It doesn't work for poor people. It doesn't work for working class people. It's not working for Native Americans. It's not working for Latinos. The policing system works for a certain select group in this country. That's the system that we have right now that exists. Some people want to reform the policing system. I've been down that road. Reforming policing does not work. I'm done with reforms. I'm saying we need to override that system. We need to tear that system down and we need to build something new. That is part of the road to abolition. That's what I'm saying. When you talk about electoral politics, Katie is telling you this is the system that we have. Now she's going to go on to say, well, if you want to try third parties, listen to this.
Third parties, that's certainly admirable. Third, fourth, fifth parties. But I do also think, especially on a local level, you have DSA.
If you want to grow third parties, fourth, fifth parties, that's admirable. But Katie is letting you know that she is going to operate in the system that is in place. That's reform. Let's operate in the system that we have in place, and let's try to make some tweaks here and there. But let's not override the system. Let's not break the system. Let's not really shake the fuck out of the system. That's the difference between reformists and people who want some type of revolution, who want complete change. There's a difference from people who have a sense of urgency and people who do not. For those of you who are poor, who are working class, who have that sense of urgency, who know what it's like to not have health insurance, who know what it's like to make $7.25 an hour, who know what it's like to you working at a hospital, but you can't even afford to go to the damn hospital. I was one of those people. You know what it's like to wait tables at a restaurant that you can't afford to eat in yourself. For those people, this reform strategy, it is not happening fast enough. It is not bringing any real tangibles to their life. It is not giving them any type of change. And by the time there will be some type of change that comes through, it's not going to fucking matter because you'll probably already be dead. This is the difference between the people who are comfortable enough to tell you all you have to do is just keep putting progressives in through the Democratic Party and eventually we'll get there. Now, they'll tell you, like Katie just said, if you want to start a third party or a fourth party, that's great too. If you want to do direct action, that's great too. We can do all of these things, but they're not doing all of them. They're not. You know who is doing all of them? People like me, people like RBN, people like Hardlands Media. Honestly, the smaller channels. That's who's doing all of them. Let's be real. If you look at those of us from RBN, where did we come from? We were activists. We were heavily Bernie supporters. Some of us canvassed for Bernie Sanders, donated to Bernie Sanders and AOC and the rest of the members of the squad. We came from activism and we came from trying to do that reform strategy. We already been there. That's why we telling you, you got to do something different. So we did it their way. And we were doing activism on top of it. And we're supporting third parties. And speaking of third parties, the same people, they'll tell you, yes, we can do all of them. Do you see them bringing third party candidates on their show? You know who is? Me and my comrades over at RBN. Hardlands Media. The only large network that I see doing this stuff, as much as people like to complain and point fingers about him, is Jimmy Dore. Matthew Ho was just on Jimmy Dore's show talking about what they did to him in North Carolina, and he's running third party. So this is something that I've noticed is a constant theme. They tell you these things. People like Katie Halper, I think she means well, but she'll tell you these things. Yes, we can do all of them, but bro, you're not doing all of them. Let's go back in.
Candidates, so candidates endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America, ranging from AOC to Kristen Gonzalez, who's running now in Queens, and Jabari Brisport, Julia Salazar. And these people undoubtedly make concrete differences in people's material conditions. So while I understand people's frustration with not only the Democrats, but with the squad, I still think that what we have to be doing is building a social movement that makes it impossible for the squad not to do the right thing.
Too late. I understand people's frustrations, but there's always that but. It's too late. We should be building a social movement to make the squad accountable. No, that should have happened before they got elected. You see, Shama Sawant does this so well. She explained this very well when she came on. That social movement should have started before they were elected, and they should not have been politicians first. See, we did it backwards. You can't come back now and say, hey, we need to build a social movement to hold them accountable. Bro, they already in, they're good. What should have been done when I look back at it, we should have done what Socialist Alternative does. They have the social movement. They're helping people on the ground. So they are out there leading the fight. They already accomplished, but they led the fight to 15 in Seattle. They accomplished that. That was a part of Socialist Alternative. That was not a part of a campaign. That's what we should have been doing. And then the politicians come from the movement. They come from the organizing on the ground, and they don't pick themselves. They don't pick people who want to be career politicians. That's the difference between an organization like that and the Justice Democrats. The organization gets together and they decide who will be the best person to do it. That's how we should have done it. But hell, creating a social movement now to put some kind of pressure on them, they are gone. They so far gone. They won't even come on independent media anymore. Let's be real. Come on, get real. It's too late.
Because no one's going to do the right thing on their own. Like, it's probably apocryphal, but it's still very useful. That FDR quote where he told A. Philip Randolph, "These sound great. All these things you're saying about civil rights, the civil rights movement, that sound great. Now go ahead and make me do it." And so the left does.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Brent Hudgens, like, I'm trying not to laugh myself because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about it and I'm like, it's just funny. Like, what are we going to do now? They're already gone. Some of them coming up on 5 years, so they're about to be eligible for their pension. Come on, man. So she mentions the civil rights movement, and I want to say something about this.
Undoubtedly make concrete differences in people's material conditions. So while I understand people's frustration with not only the Democrats, but with the squad, I still think that what we have to be doing is building a social movement that makes it impossible for the squad not to do the right thing, because no one's going to do the right thing on their own. Like, it's probably apocryphal, but it's still very useful. That FDR quote where he told A. Philip Randolph, "These sound great. All these things you're saying about civil rights, the civil rights movement, that sound great. Now go ahead and make me do it." And so the left does, to some extent, I mean, not to some extent, to a large extent, we have to go out and make these politicians do the right thing. We have to force their hand. They need us to force their hand, because they can't even if they like certain things, they have to show that there's popular will demanding it.
We've been forcing their hand. We've been forcing their hand. We forced their hand with the Marches for Medicare for All. And it was larger podcasters who criticized us for doing that. Didn't we try to force their hand, force the vote? We've been trying to force their hand. They are gone. Now, she mentioned the civil rights movement, and I want to mention something about that. What people often leave out when you look at like the civil rights movement, that was just the beginning. There was more planned. A lot of times in the education system, they only teach you the bare necessities about the civil rights movement. Now, I have to know more about it. Sorry, I can't talk tonight. I happen to know more about it because of my grandparents. So my grandparents educated me about the civil rights movement. So the areas that the school system left out, my grandparents filled in. What they accomplished with the civil rights movement, desegregation, fighting for equality between white people and black people, that was just the beginning. One of the other things that Martin Luther King wanted to do, he wanted to fight for universal basic income. That was next on his agenda. See, once he accomplished, once they accomplished the social issues, the social fight, next was the economic fight. And I really believe that's why he was killed. One of the issues, universal basic income. Andrew Yang brought this to the surface again when he ran for president in 2020. MLK wanted to do that. MLK wanted to give African Americans reparations for slavery. MLK wanted to organize the workers. You see, MLK was anti-capitalist. MLK, when you look at the civil rights movement, they weren't trying to do reform. They wanted to change the whole system. And they didn't do it through electoral politics. And I honestly believe if they tried to do it through electoral politics, they wouldn't have won. And I think MLK knew that. And I think Malcolm X knew that. And I think all of those civil rights activists that were out there with them, marching with them, sit-ins, getting beaten, having dogs sicked on them, being jailed, I think they all knew that trying to do that path through electoralism was not going to work. That's what we need to happen. If you do want to vote third party, vote independent. But why would you sit here after everything you just heard her say? Why would you sit here and still vote in this corrupt duopoly where even the progressives you put in are going into the same corruption and they just going to sell you out? Why would you continue to do it? What's great about that? So the civil rights movement is something that we should be looking at and we should be taking notes on, because all the pressure came from the outside. Then the politicians made those changes. Now, some people say, why don't we do that now for the squad? Because we've been doing that and they just ignore it. They're gone. AOC is a career politician. She ain't coming back, boo. She is not coming back. And that was her goal all along, by the way. We have to change what we have been doing. And I refuse to play this game anymore. Let's go back in.
You know, I was struck in response to my own question that on June 12th, Sunday, June 12th, there was an election in France which surprised an awful lot of people because several political parties on the far left got together, unified, and ran a political campaign and basically got the same votes as the sitting president, Mr. Macron. He's in a very, very bad and weakening position by the hour, but it is not because of the right. It's because of the left that this situation is coming to a head. And I think it portends all kinds of things that are going to happen in this country too. All right, in the little bit of time we have left, how do you account for the growth of the right wing? Why are right-wing politicians, policies, why are we watching this spectacle of the January 6th committee? What happened to make the right wing as strong as it appears to be?
Wait till you hear this, guys. I already know the answer to this, but listen to this.
Well, they say that Republicans fear their base and Democrats disdain their base, and I think that's true. So I think that...
But Democrats disdain their base because people like you keep telling us to still vote for them. I'll say it again. Democrats disdain their base because people like Katie Halper, even though she's left independent media, she still keep telling you to vote for Democrats. That's why.
That's a big part of it. I think that also something we can't lose sight of is how funded the right wing is. So, you know, the Tea Party was funded by ALEC. These are basically AstroTurf movements. They pretend to be organic grassroots movements, which doesn't mean that there aren't regular people who just join them, but they're very funded and coordinated by extremely wealthy institutions. The Koch brothers, for instance. There's also a lot of discipline on the right wing, I think. And there really isn't any equivalent of the Tea Party on the left. The left equivalent of a Tea Party would be an actually like unapologetically fearless populist movement, and actually populist as opposed to the right-wing populism, which is not populism, it's pseudo-populism. But they are well-funded, they're a well-oiled machine. They have a lot of message discipline, and they fear their base. I think those are some of the reasons why. And they're unapologetic. I think that's probably the biggest thing. People get a sense when people are kind of hedging and when they're being hypocritical. And the Republicans are hypocrites, but they're open hypocrites. Democrats pretend not to be hypocrites, and that's in some ways more hypocritical than the other one.
Good point. All right. I wish we had.
Okie doke. So one thing I do want to say here about why the right seems to be just building and building. Number one, they're organized. And when I say organized, they're organized. They know how to get thousands and hundreds and thousands of people to come together to protest against something. I'll give them that. They know how to get people together. They have the money to get people together. When it's time for them to make sure that their voices are heard, they're organized. They're also organized locally. So that's one of the things I think that would need to change. And number two, Delthea pointed it out. I think I lost it. But Delthea pointed it out. She was mentioning that Republicans know that their base will draw blood if they don't deliver. It's true. It's true. Yeah, their base tends to be more vocal and they don't feel bad about being vocal. There it is. Republicans know their base will draw blood if lied or ignored too. That's true. No, they know they're vocal. They're not ashamed of being vocal. Democrats, like, you know, the liberals, I always talk about this. The liberals, they kill me. They act like if they say something negative about Democrats in power, that they should be ashamed or they shouldn't say it out loud. Well, I better keep quiet because I don't want them to lose again. You know, it's just this, they cower to that type of fear. And it's just really, it's sad, actually, in a way. It's pretty pathetic. But there was one thing that she mentioned about the hypocrites and things like that. I don't even know if it's necessarily each party trying to be hypocritical. I think both parties know exactly what they're doing. I think they're there to please their donors and they're there to please Wall Street. I don't think they're trying to, or they're being hypocritical per se. I think they know exactly what they're doing. I'll be honest about that. But I'm sorry. In reference to reform, what I was telling you guys before, this is why the reform doesn't work. You can't tweak the system. We tried that in education. We tried it multiple times to tweak the system. It doesn't work. We said, let's add this, let's add that. The kids are still underperforming. We've tried all these different tweaks. Schools are a business. You have to change the whole thing. You have to override the system. When it comes to politics, when it comes to Democratic Party, reforming the Democratic Party, it don't work. You know why? Because the party's controlled by Wall Street. If you want to override the system, there's two different things that you can do. Number one, you get corporate money out of politics. Obviously, that is not going to be easy. But that's where your focus should be. Because as long as they're both controlled by corporate money, they're not going to do the bidding for your interest. And number two, you got to stop voting in this duopoly. You got to stop voting for corrupt Democrats, corrupt Republicans. You have to start voting third party and independent. And people hear me, they say that like, oh, but that's so hard. That's so difficult. Not really. When you go to vote, you have an option. The problem is you have to change your way of thinking. You have to stop telling yourself, I have to check off this person's name on the box. No, you don't. You really don't. Surprise. Reforming it doesn't work. Reforming it doesn't work because it doesn't override the system. That's why. Policing, same thing. Reforming it, is that working out? No, you have to override the system. Any of my friends that's worked in IT, they're familiar with that. They know about overriding shit. If they try to do tweaks here and there and they realize it's not working out, whoa, we need to just come in and override the whole system. That's what has to happen. And we need to push more mutual aid and direct action. I'm sorry for people to say, oh, we don't have the money. We don't have the money to do it because people are donating their money to politicians. If you take back the money that you donated to Bernie Sanders, that you donated to the squad, that you donated to Nancy Pelosi, all of these politicians, and you put that money into mutual aid organizations, we could have helped ourselves instead of sitting up here relying on the United States government to come in and rescue. But no, give me your money. This is all they say. Give me your money. Every time. So no shade on Katie Halper, but I'm sorry. She's part of the very same problem that she's complaining about. Because it's people like her, you an independent media, you supposed to be on the left. You still telling people to do the same thing, to donate to this corrupt party. So no,